Why did everyone laugh the moment she stepped onto the training yard? Not a cruel laugh at first. More like disbelief. The kind that forms when people decide, instantly, that someone doesn't belong. She stood there with her duffel at her feet, boots half a size too big, uniform faded like it had lived another life before it reached her. Small frame, quiet eyes, no visible edge. The wind tugged loose strands of soft brown hair across her face, and she didn't bother fixing them. "Dead weight," someone muttered. The word stuck. It always does. Nobody asked her name. They didn't need to. In places like this, names only mattered if you earned them. What they saw instead was what they wanted to see: a mistake on the roster, a charity case, someone's paperwork error standing in flesh and bone. The laughter rolled across the gravel yard. She didn't react. Then a hand grabbed her wrist. It was meant as a joke, a bored officer looking for entertainment before the real work began. He tugged her sleeve up, just enough to expose skin. The sound didn't stop all at once. It drained. Black ink, sharp, intentional. KLL-013. The officer froze, so did everyone else. No one laughed now, no one spoke. Minutes later, the sky answered a question nobody had dared to ask yet. Rotor blades thundered overhead, chopping the valley air apart. Dust and grit lifted as a military helicopter descended, not scheduled, not announced. A general stepped out. He didn't look at the recruits, didn't scan the lines. His eyes locked onto her like he'd been looking for her all along. "Whoever carries that code," he said calmly, "answers only to me." She didn't flinch, didn't straighten, didn't look proud. She simply pulled her sleeve back down and walked away. The air changed after that, heavier, quieter, like something dangerous had just passed through and left its shadow behind. By nightfall, the NATO training camp revealed its true face. Concrete walls, steel doors, wind howling through a valley that swallowed sound and gave nothing back. Elite recruits filled the barracks, men who ran marathons with weight on their backs, women who stripped rifles blindfolded like muscle memory was carved into their bones. And her, assigned to the lowest-ranked squad, the leftovers, the ones nobody cared enough to shape. No reputation, no file anyone could find, just Mitchell, Sarah typed on a bunk assignment and a thin mattress in the corner. The squad leader, Carter, had a jaw like stone and eyes trained to ignore problems rather than solve them. "Stay out of the way," he said, tossing her a canteen without looking. "Don't make me regret this." She nodded once. That night, lying on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, Sarah felt the familiar pressure build behind her ribs. Not fear, not anger. Memory. She forced it down. She always did. The first test came early. Logistics drill, crates stacked high, time limits shouted, stress engineered on purpose. She worked quietly, efficiently, no wasted movement, hands steady. That was when Donovan decided she needed reminding. He shoved a crate into her path just as she turned. She stumbled, barely catching herself. "Careful, charity case," he laughed, "those noodle arms slowing us down." Laughter followed, it always did. Someone dumped supplies into the dirt at her feet, bandages, rations, clean things now smeared and useless. "Oops," Donovan said, "clean it up." She knelt, collected every item, methodical, controlled, the way you do when reacting would cost more than silence. Her shoulders tightened, just slightly. Nobody noticed, or maybe they pretended not to. The physical drills were worse. Mud-swallowing boots, barbed wire biting skin, packs heavy enough to bend posture and pride. She lagged, not because she couldn't push harder, but because she chose not to. "Let her sit this one out," someone called. "She might sprain a nail." Another voice, sharp, female. "Why does the army even accept trash like her?" Sarah kept her eyes down, focused on breath, on rhythm, on not letting old instincts surface where they didn't belong. Because once they did, they never fully went back. Later, during a rare pause, the squad huddled around a broken radio. Static drowned every channel. Frustration mounted. Sarah stepped forward without asking. She unscrewed the casing, reconnected a loose circuit, fingers moving like they remembered something her mouth never would. The radio crackled alive. Coordinates clear. An instructor watched her, longer than necessary. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. She shrugged and picked it up. It wasn't a lie, just incomplete. Dinner brought no relief. Metal trays clanged, jokes sharpened. Typing pools down the road, someone laughed. She sat alone, spine straight, hands folded, silence wrapped around her like armor. Inside, something cracked, just a hairline fracture, enough to ache, not enough to show. Medical training turned crueler. Mock blood, mock wounds, real contempt. "Nurse nobody," they chanted. She wrapped the bandage perfectly, too perfectly, tight enough to hold, tight enough to hurt. Still, she said nothing. The night march was where things shifted. Forest dark, GPS units glowing, confidence loud. She noticed the error before anyone else did. "You're walking into a radar trap," she whispered. They laughed, until the alert screamed. "Abort, abort." Back at base, no one met her eyes. Carter glanced at her once, jaw tight. Later that night, she sat on her bunk, unlacing boots slowly. Fingers brushed her sleeve, checking the ink beneath. Still there. Still waiting. Lieutenant Colonel Harrow watched from the doorway, said nothing, wrote something down. That was the first time someone noticed her without underestimating her. And it wouldn't be the last. Because buried beneath that faded uniform and quiet obedience was something none of them were ready to face. Not yet. And she wasn't ready to tell them. Why did the silence feel heavier than the insults ever had? By the second week, no one laughed as loudly anymore. They still mocked her, just quieter now, more careful, as if something unseen had stepped into the room and stayed there. Sarah felt it too. Not relief. Tension. That kind that crawls under the skin when you know you're being watched, but not protected. The map-reading exercise began under a dull, gray sky. Wind pressed low over the open field, flattening grass and patience alike. Recruits spread out in clusters, pencils scratching against laminated maps, voices rising with certainty they hadn't earned. Sarah stood alone. Her map was folded cleanly, corners sharp, pencil marks precise. She didn't rush, never rushed. Speed came later. Accuracy came first. "Hey!" A shadow fell across her work. Gavin, loud, confident, cruel in the way insecure people often are. "What's that, a treasure map?" He snatched the paper from her hands before she could react, ripping it straight down the middle. The sound cut sharper than the wind. Scraps fluttered away. The laughter followed. "Go fetch it," he said, stepping closer. "Dead weight." Sarah didn't move. She watched the pieces scatter, memorized where they landed, then reached calmly into her pocket and pulled out another map, unfolded it, kept working. Her silence hit harder than any comeback. That unsettled them. Because silence doesn't argue. It waits. The harassment didn't stop, it evolved. During weapons inspection, Officer Bragg stopped in front of her like a predator bored of easier prey. "Why you always covering that wrist?" he barked. Before she could answer, he grabbed her arm and yanked her sleeve up. Ink caught the fluorescent light. KLL-013. The room erupted. Fake laughs, nervous ones. Jensen doubled over, clutching his stomach. "You get that at a tattoo shop." "Emo phase," Riley smirked. Bragg chuckled, but it died halfway through when Sarah met his eyes. For 1 second, just one, he saw something behind them. Not fear, not shame, recognition. "Get back in line," he muttered, suddenly eager to move on. That night, Lieutenant Colonel Harrow didn't sleep. He sat alone in his office, lamp low, shadows thick. He pulled an encrypted file from a locked drawer, one he hadn't opened in years. Fingers hovered over the keyboard longer than necessary before typing the access code. The screen flickered. Ghost Viper 13. Status missing. Kill count 208. A younger photo stared back at him. Same eyes. Same silence. "She disappeared," he whispered, 4 years ago. Harrow leaned back, pulse thudding. He didn't feel fear, he felt dread. Because if she was here by choice, then something had gone very wrong. The next morning, live fire drills. The range smelled of metal and burnt powder. Recruits lined up, eager to prove something, anything. Sarah was given the simplest target, stationary, close range. Carter didn't even face her. "Just don't shoot your foot off." She raised the rifle, breathed out. Jensen stumbled into her lane on purpose. Her shot went wide. Laughter exploded. Jensen grinned, grabbed a marker and scribbled across her sleeve, 13D. "Perfect 0, he said. Sarah wiped the ink away slowly. She didn't look angry. That scared him more than anger would have. Later, scrubbing pots in the mess hall, her sleeves rolled up. Ellis noticed the tattoo again. "What's that number?" he shouted. "Your body count from bad Tinder dates." The room roared. Ellis threw a greasy rag at her chest. "Cover it up." Sarah caught it before it hit the floor, folded it neatly, set it aside. When her eyes met Ellis's, his grin faltered, just a fraction. Enough. That afternoon, everything cracked. A surprise sniper trial, invitation only, moving targets, speed and precision. The general himself watched. "This isn't for you," Carter said, smirking. Sarah stepped forward anyway. Boots quiet on gravel. 5 shots. 6 seconds. 5 bullseyes. Silence. The general walked closer, lifted her wrist, froze. "KEL War Tier 3, he murmured. For the first time, someone looked at her like they knew exactly what she was. That night, whispers filled the barracks. Nobody laughed anymore. They watched her clean her rifle alone, movements calm, practiced, almost reverent. Harrow and the general spoke behind locked doors. "If she's really 13, the general asked, why is she hiding?" Harrow had no answer. But he noticed something else. Her bunk was packed like she could disappear at a moment's notice. Because she could. And deep down she knew it. The final insult came fast. Lucas stood in the yard waving papers. "She's fake, no clearance, no history." He ripped her name badge off. "We don't recognize you." Sarah stood, reached into her pocket, dropped a small black token onto the ground. It clinked once. "Ghost Unit Command." The sound sucked the air out of the yard. Lucas stepped back. And in that moment, everyone realized the truth. They hadn't been standing above her all this time. They'd been standing in front of her. And she'd let them. Because strength doesn't always fight back. Sometimes, it waits for the world to expose itself first. Why did fear settle in only after the truth was revealed? Not the loud kind. Not panic. The quiet kind. The kind that creeps in when people realize they've crossed a line they can't uncross. The training base changed overnight. Not officially. No announcements, no speeches. But tone lives in the small things, in footsteps, in glances, in who speaks and who suddenly doesn't. Sarah felt it the moment she stepped outside the barracks. People moved out of her way. Not with respect. With distance. The yard that once echoed with jokes now carried only boots on gravel and clipped commands. Conversations died when she passed. Eyes dropped. Shoulders stiffened. She hated that more than the insults. Fear was heavier than mockery. Colder. During roll call, Carter called her name last. His voice was quieter than usual, stripped of edge. Mitchell. She answered with a single nod. No smile. No triumph. Inside, something churned. This wasn't why she'd come. Riley avoided her entirely now. Jensen kept his hands busy, polishing gear that was already clean. Tors, who once laughed the loudest, couldn't meet her eyes. Only Harrow watched her openly. He stood near the edge of the field, notebook gone, hands clasped behind his back, studying her not as a threat, but as a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. Sarah trained the same way she always had. Quiet, precise, controlled. But now every movement drew attention. During close-quarters drills, instructors hovered. During tactical briefings, questions were suddenly directed at her, carefully phrased, respectful, cautious. What would you recommend here, Mitchell? She answered only when necessary. Short sentences, no ego. Because she knew something they didn't. Once you step back into the light, it's harder to disappear again. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily anymore. Memories pressed in heat shimmering over sand, radio static cutting through screams, the weight of a body going still against her shoulder. 208. The number wasn't pride. It was gravity. She turned onto her side and pulled her sleeve down, even though no one was watching. She'd worn that code once without hiding it. That version of her had vanished for a reason. The following morning, a perimeter drill pushed the squad into the forest again. Fog clung low, swallowing sound. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Nerves were high. Walsh led, confidence forced now, not natural. Sarah walked near the rear. She noticed the silence first. Not the peaceful kind, the wrong kind. Her pace slowed. She scanned left, right. Then she saw it. Disturbed earth, too clean, too deliberate. Stop, she said. Walsh ignored her. She grabbed his pack and yanked him back just as a simulated explosive marker lit up beneath his boot. The instructor's voice cut through the fog. That would have killed your lead. No one spoke. Walsh didn't thank her. He didn't apologize either. But his hands shook as he adjusted his grip. Back at base, tension snapped. Lucas wasn't there anymore. Transferred overnight, no goodbyes. No one asked where. Everyone understood. That afternoon, Sarah was called to Harrow's office. He gestured for her to sit. She didn't. I won't force you, he said quietly, but I need to ask. She waited. Why are you here? The question hung between them, heavy and fragile. She could lie. She'd lied before. Instead, she said, because I needed to remember who I was without the noise. Harrow studied her face. And did you? She hesitated. Yes, she said, and no. He nodded like that made sense. A helicopter arrived just after noon the next day. Unscheduled, unmarked. Blades cut the valley air apart. Recruits froze mid-drill, shielding their eyes as dust and gravel lifted. Sarah felt it before she saw it. That pull. That quiet certainty. The door slid open. General Hamilton stepped out. His gaze found her immediately. KLL-013, he called. You're recalled. The yard went dead silent. As of now, he continued, this base falls under your authority. A collective breath caught. Sarah didn't move. Didn't smile. Didn't bow. She adjusted her sleeve. Covered the tattoo. and walked toward the helicopter. Perry stepped forward, hands shaking, holding a worn letter. "You saved my brother's unit," he said, "in Syria." Her hand paused on the door. "Tell him," she said softly, "to stay alive." Then she boarded. The helicopter lifted. Dust settled. And what was left behind wasn't relief. It was reckoning. Because strength doesn't shout. It doesn't announce itself. It endures. And sometimes, it leaves before anyone can apologize. What happens after the helicopter disappears, when the noise fades and no one knows what to say next? The valley didn't return to normal. It couldn't. The dust settled slowly, like the ground itself needed time to understand what had just happened. Recruits stood frozen long after the helicopter vanished into the clouds, eyes squinting at empty sky, hands clenched around straps and weapons that suddenly felt meaningless. Sarah Mitchell was gone. And somehow, everything felt heavier because of it. Training resumed officially. Whistles blew, orders were barked, but the rhythm was wrong, too sharp in some places, too hesitant in others, like a song missing a note everyone remembered but couldn't hum. No one joked anymore. They spoke in half-sentences, whispered names without finishing them. KLL-013. A code that wasn't supposed to exist. The first consequence arrived quietly. Lucas's bunk was empty that evening, his locker cleaned out, names scratched off the board with clinical efficiency, no explanation given, no destination listed. By morning, everyone understood that questions were dangerous. Jensen felt it next. He trained harder than anyone else that week, ran until his knees swelled, cleaned his rifle obsessively, spoke to no one. When promotion lists went up, his name wasn't there. It never appeared again. Riley lost her smile long before she lost anything else. A comment she once posted, sarcastic, cruel, careless, resurfaced. Screenshots don't forget, even when people do. Sponsors pulled out quietly. Her phone stopped buzzing with praise and started buzzing with silence. She didn't mention Sarah again. Tors stopped laughing entirely. He got a call during dinner one night. His face drained of color. He nodded too much, said yes, sir 3 times. His family's contracting business came under review the next week. No one teased him about his gold chain anymore. The punishments weren't loud. They were precise. Just like her. Lieutenant Colonel Harrow watched it unfold without comment. He didn't intervene, didn't defend anyone. He knew better. This wasn't revenge. It was consequence. One evening, long after lights out, Harrow found a folded note on his desk. No envelope, no signature. Just one line. Keep the file locked. He burned it that night. Watched the paper curl into itself, the ink blackening before turning to ash. He didn't feel relief. He felt respect. Weeks passed. The base settled into something like order again. New routines, new silence. But Sarah lingered. In the way people hesitated before making a joke. In the way instructors double-checked assumptions. In the way some recruits trained harder not to impress, but to deserve the uniform they wore. Sometimes late at night, Perry reread the letter from Syria. He imagined her there, not loud, not heroic, just moving through smoke and fire with the same quiet certainty she'd carried across the training yard. Carrying wounded men without asking for recognition, without asking for forgiveness, because forgiveness was never the point. Somewhere far from the base, Sarah sat alone in the belly of another aircraft. Different mission, different name. Same silence. She stared at her hands resting loosely in her lap, scarred in places no one ever noticed, steady. She didn't feel victorious. She felt tired. The kind of tired that settles in the bones after years of holding everything together, while pretending you're made of less. The general across from her finally spoke. "You could have stayed," he said. "Taken command taught them." Sarah didn't look up. "They wouldn't have learned," she replied. "Not the right lesson." He studied her, and what lesson was that? She thought for a moment. That dignity doesn't ask permission. The aircraft hummed around them. The general nodded slowly. Outside, the world moved on loud, impatient, hungry for stories it could simplify. But Sarah never fit into simple stories. She wasn't a symbol. She wasn't a warning. She was a reminder. That strength doesn't need an audience. That resilience can look like silence. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away with your truth intact. And somewhere behind her, in a valley filled with concrete and steel, a group of people would carry that lesson long after her name faded from their tongues. Because some figures don't linger as legends. They linger as standards. Why did the quiet feel louder now that no one was questioning her anymore? Silence had always been her companion. But this was different. This silence didn't test her. It reminded her. The aircraft droned steadily through the dark, red cabin lights casting soft shadows across steel and faces that didn't ask questions. No one here needed explanations. Names were temporary. Histories irrelevant. What mattered was what you could carry and what you could leave behind. Sarah sat alone, helmet resting against her knee, fingers loosely wrapped around the strap. Across from her, operators checked gear, adjusted gloves, murmured to one another in a language built from trust and repetition. She wasn't one of them anymore. Not really. She'd earned her place once, long ago, but belonging had a cost she wasn't sure she could pay again. The general's words echoed faintly in her mind. "You could have stayed." She closed her eyes. Stayed where? Among people who feared her now. Among systems that only understood strength after it revealed its teeth. The truth sat heavier than her pack ever had. She wasn't running from them. She was running from herself. When the aircraft landed, the heat hit first. Dry, immediate, familiar, somewhere between desert and memory. She stepped down onto the tarmac without ceremony, boots finding ground like they remembered it. No applause. No welcome. Just another shadow stepping into another night. The safe house was sparse. Concrete walls, one table, one chair, a mirror cracked at the corner. She set her gear down carefully like it mattered how it landed. Then she rolled her sleeve up. KLL-013. She stared at the ink longer than usual. She hadn't earned it the way people thought. Not with pride. Not with hunger. It had been assigned, logged, tallied. 208 decisions made under pressure so intense it left no room for regret until later. No faces stayed long enough to haunt her individually. They blurred together. Shapes, movements, threats neutralized before they could become names. That was the lie she'd told herself. Because sometimes, late at night, one face still broke through. A boy not older than 20, rifle shaking, eyes wide with fear that mirrored her own once. She hadn't hesitated. She always hesitated later. Sarah sat down heavily, elbows on knees, breathing slow and measured. She hadn't joined to become a ghost. She'd joined to matter. The first time she'd been called Deadweight, years ago, it hadn't been cruel, just dismissive. She'd been smaller then too, quieter, easier to overlook. She remembered proving them wrong. She also remembered what it took. The radio crackled softly from the corner of the room. Low volume, routine check-in. She didn't answer right away. For the first time in years, she questioned whether she wanted to. Outside, the night carried distant sounds, vehicles, voices, life continuing in fragments. She wondered how many of those lives would intersect with hers before morning. and whether she'd be the same afterward. At the base she'd left behind, Perry sat on his bunk, boots untouched at his feet. He'd been replaying everything in his head since she left. Every moment he'd watched her say nothing when others spoke too much. Every time she'd stepped in just before something went wrong. He realized now that she'd never been trying to prove herself. She'd been preventing damage. He unfolded the letter again, tracing the words his brother had written months after returning from Syria. She moved like she knew exactly where death would land and stood somewhere else. Perry swallowed hard. He'd always thought courage looked loud. He was starting to understand it didn't. Harrow stood alone at the edge of the training yard that same night, staring out at the valley. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of dust and cold metal. He wondered how many like her had passed through his career unnoticed. Or worse, noticed too late. He thought about the way she'd stood when accused, when mocked, when revealed. Never defensive. Never cruel. Just present. He realized then that leadership wasn't about commanding respect. It was about deserving it, even when no one gave it. Back in the safe house, Sarah finally answered the radio. "Go ahead." A pause, then a familiar voice, older, measured. "Mission's optional," it said. "You're not obligated." She almost laughed. "Almost. When did obligation ever stop us?" she replied. Another pause. "We can assign someone else." Sarah looked at her hands again, at the scars that told stories no report ever captured. "No," she said quietly, "I'll do it. Because some debts weren't written down. They lived inside you." She stood, rolling her shoulders, feeling the old rhythm return. Muscle memory woke like something stretching after a long sleep. She checked her weapon, movements precise but slower than they used to be. Age hadn't weakened her. Time had sharpened her awareness of what each action cost. Before leaving, she stopped in front of the cracked mirror. For a moment, she didn't recognize the woman looking back. Not the ghost. Not the symbol. Just a tired soldier trying to make peace with the distance between who she was and who she'd become. She pulled her sleeve down. Not to hide the code. To remind herself it wasn't the whole story. As she stepped into the night, the world didn't pause. It never did. But somewhere behind her, in a valley she no longer belonged to, people trained differently now, spoke differently, thought differently. Not because they feared her, but because she'd shown them something rare. Strength without cruelty. Power without noise. And ahead of her in the dark waited another mission. Another choice. Another chance, not at redemption, but at honesty. Because sometimes the hardest battle isn't against an enemy. It's against the version of yourself that learned to survive and forgot how to live. Why did it feel harder to step forward now than it ever had under fire? The night swallowed her quickly. No applause. No countdown. Just movement. Sarah advanced through the outskirts of the city with the kind of caution that came from experience, not fear. The mission briefing had been simple: extraction, one asset, no escalation. The kind of operation she'd run dozens of times before she disappeared. Before she chose quiet over chaos. The streets were narrow, broken light flickered from dying lamps. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then stopped. Her breath stayed slow, measured, the rhythm of someone who knew panic wasted time. She paused at the corner. Listened. This was where instinct mattered, not rank, not reputation. Just judgment. She moved. The building was half collapsed, concrete fractured like bone after impact. Inside, the air smelled of dust and oil. Her boots barely touched the floor as she climbed, each step placed with intention. Second floor. Third. A muffled sound. She froze. a voice strained, controlled, trying not to shake. She followed it. The asset was younger than she expected, barely holding it together, hands tied, eyes darting like prey that hadn't learned yet that panic made noise. When he saw her, relief crashed over his face so hard it almost broke him. "I knew they'd send someone," he whispered. Sarah didn't answer. She cut the restraints, checked his breathing, his injuries. "You can walk?" she asked. He nodded too fast. They moved. Halfway down the stairwell, everything went wrong. It always did. Footsteps too many, too close. She shoved him behind her, weapon raised. Time slowed, the way it always did when choices mattered. She could clear the stairwell. She could disappear. But the kid wouldn't. She shifted. The first shot echoed like thunder in the enclosed space. Then another. Then silence. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, listening for echoes that never came. Her heart didn't race. It sank. They exited through the rear, slipping into shadow just as lights flared where they'd been seconds before. She guided him through alleys, across debris, over obstacles that would have stopped anyone else. He stumbled once. She caught him. Not roughly, not urgently. Just firmly enough to keep him upright. When the extraction vehicle finally came into view, the kid laughed, breathless, disbelieving. "We made it," he said. Sarah didn't respond. She helped him inside, closed the door, and stood there. The driver looked at her. "You coming?" She hesitated. For a moment, everything she'd buried pressed forward. The base. The recruits. The silence after laughter. The code on her wrist. She climbed in. The vehicle pulled away, tires crunching over rubble, leaving the building behind like a bad memory. Only this one didn't fade. Hours later, debrief was brief. Successful extraction, minimal engagement. No medals, no mention of names. She preferred it that way. She sat alone afterward, cleaning her weapon out of habit more than necessity. Her hands moved smoothly, but her thoughts wandered. She realized something then. She didn't feel empty anymore. Tired, yes, but not hollow. The kid found her later, standing awkwardly like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to speak. "They said you're the reason I'm alive," he said. Sarah finally looked at him. "Lots of reasons," she replied. He shook his head. "You didn't have to stay, you could have left." She considered that. "Yes," she said, "I could have. But you didn't." "No." He smiled, not wide, not dramatic, just grateful. When he left, Sarah remained where she was, staring at nothing. That was when she understood. Redemption wasn't about undoing the past. It was about choosing differently when the opportunity returned. Days later, she stood on a quiet airstrip at dawn. The sky was pale, undecided. She held a small envelope in her hand. Inside was a reassignment offer. Training, advisory, limited field exposure. A chance to shape instead of disappear. She thought of the recruits she'd left behind, not the cruelty, the potential. People who didn't know yet that strength could exist without shouting. She thought of Perry, of Harrow, of the way silence had followed her departure. And she thought of herself. The woman who had survived by becoming less visible. She folded the paper once, then again, and made her choice. Months later, a different base woke under a different sky. No helicopters, no spectacle. Just a woman standing at the edge of a training field, sleeves rolled down, posture relaxed, eyes observant. New recruits ran past her without looking twice. That was fine. One of them struggled, smaller than the rest, falling behind, jaw clenched in quiet determination. Someone laughed. Sarah stepped forward. "Keep moving," she said calmly, not to the one who laughed but to the one being tested. The recruit nodded and kept going. Sarah watched, hands behind her back, expression unreadable. She didn't need them to know her name. She didn't need them to see the ink on her wrist. What mattered was what they'd learn without realizing it. That dignity doesn't need permission. That strength doesn't announce itself. That resilience can look like silence. Years later, someone would ask about her. Not loudly. Not often. Just enough to keep the question alive. And the answer would always be the same. She was there when it mattered. Because in the end, Sarah Mitchell didn't need respect. She didn't need fear. She carried her truth all along, etched in ink, reinforced by restraint proven through choice. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.